This happened a few years ago, and I've told only family members and a priest about all that happened. My friend, let's call her Ash, had always told me there was something in her house, and yes, I had a feeling of something being there. Now, my sister says it seems that some of our mother's side of the family have a sense of things like this. At first, Ash told me there was a ghost in our house, and it wasn't anything bad. And honestly, from our experiences, it seemed to only play with people if they had long hair. Once I fell asleep and woke up with my hair braided. One summer, Ash was dating this guy who was a complete jerk. I hated the guy. One day, Ash starts telling me there was something new in her house. Well, it was new to me. She told me this thing always came when she started to date somebody. I didn't think much of it, but then she explained how things were starting to get bad. One day she woke up in the middle of the night, feeling something in her bed. She woke up and her sheets were ripped. Not ripped like there was a hole torn in it, but more like something had clawed through them. She began to wake up with claw marks and bruises on her body. She started to have me over more often, especially when her mom, stepdad, or sister were gone. And let me just say, things were getting scary. One night, we were in the pool, and I felt as though we were being watched. I looked up on her roof, and I swear to God, I saw something moving. It looked like someone was on their hands and knees, crawling around on the roof. At first, I thought it was the neighbor kid, playing a joke on us. But I saw red eyes, and I could hear the claws clacking on the roof. I stared at this thing for a minute, and it stared back at me. I'm not a church-going person, but at the time my mom was battling lung cancer and wanted to go back to church. Quickly, I started to say a prayer, and the thing closed its eyes and literally disappeared. After that experience, I told Ash again and again to get someone to bless her house. She didn't listen, and it only got worse. One day, we had another friend named Ty come over to help. He was a Wiccan, and I had hoped that he would back me up, telling Ash to get the house blessed. We go back to Ash, and Ty wanted to make a ring of protection and try to figure out what the thing wanted. At first, I didn't think anything would happen, and almost wanted to leave, but then something did. Ty's eyes became black, and he grabbed Ash, growling and yelling at her. "You know what I want. You know what you did." He said it in a voice so deep, it could not have been Ty. Being from a Catholic background, my instincts kicked in, and again I said a prayer. I put my hands on Ty, who tried to attack me for a moment, but then he stopped, and soon he came back to himself, asking what had happened. We told him, and I could see his face turn pale. We had to break the ring for someone to turn the lights on. You can probably guess who it had to be. Yep, it was me. I ran across the room as fast as I could and flipped the lights on. The moment I had stepped out of the ring, I could hear flies in my ear, like thousands of them were buzzing around me. It had only stopped the moment the lights switched on. We sat there in silence, taking deep breaths, trying to relax, when Ty said he had to go to the bathroom. The only one in the house was downstairs. I sat there with Ash to keep her calm since she was in tears. Then my phone began to ring, and it was Ty. Confused, I tried to answer, but I couldn't hear anything on the other end. So I was assuming he butt dialed me and hung up. But again he called back. On the other line, there was no breathing, no sound of movement whatsoever. After a while, Ty came back. Ty is a chubby guy, and he was moving rather quickly. You could tell he was scared. He came in asking why I didn't answer my phone. I told him that I did, and I didn't hear anything on the other end. So I asked him what was going on. He said he had gone downstairs and he was walking to the bathroom. You have to go through the living room to get to the bathroom, and he was walking through the living room when he heard someone call his name. Of course, he turned toward the noise, and what he saw in front of him chilled him to the bone. When he turned, he saw something 6 feet tall, something a human shape with red eyes, watching him. Immediately, he ran to the bathroom and locked the door and called me. After a moment, he began to walk out of the bathroom, but he could still see those eyes, so we stepped back in and made another call to me. When he didn't get an answer, he made a run for the bedroom we were in. After that, Ty was done. He left and I stayed with Ash that night. I had told my parents what was going on, what was happening to Ash, and how she was scared to stay alone. About a week later, Ash was on a trip to Florida, and it was a nice summer night, so I had my windows opened. I was about to go to bed and only had my eyes closed for about 10 minutes before I heard something. I looked, and standing next to my bed was a little boy. All in a flash, the boy jumped into my bed, grabbed me by my wrists, pinning me down, and he told me, "I'm not scared of you." I struggled violently for a moment. One moment my eyes were closed, and the next they were open. And in that time, he was gone. All that was left was a bruise the size and shape of a tiny hand. First thing I did was call Ash. I told her what happened, and she was very quiet. She stayed quiet for a moment before saying that she had Ty come back and that he had brought a spirit board. They both knew there was no way in hell that I would ever mess with something like that, and if I had a chance, I would toss that thing out of the window. The demon, as I started to call it, asked them, "Where's your little friend?" So of course they asked who it was talking about. My name is Caitlin, and I do go by Katie, and I wasn't surprised that Ash told me that that's what the thing replied. Soon after that, Ash was over at my house, and I was giving her hell for being on the Ouija board, and she was blowing me off, saying it was nothing. Then she told me that this demon told her its name, and I immediately recognized it. She kept saying it and saying it. Now, unless you're someone trained in dealing with this kind of thing, saying the name of a demon can give it power. I kicked her out of my house, and I had my parents call the priest to bless our home. About a year later, I was hanging out with Ash and another friend named Emily. It had been a long time since I had spent the night with Ash, since I got sick of her boyfriend and his short jokes. Ash was telling me that her mom had saged the house not too long ago, and that the demon was finally gone. When I walked into that house, I noticed that it did feel somewhat different. Not like the thing was gone, but different. I just thought I was on edge because of everything that had happened in the past. After a night of driving around going to places that were said to be haunted, we got back to Ash's and turned in for the night. Ash and her boyfriend were in one bed, and Emily and I were in another, in the same room. After sleeping a few hours, I woke up. I noticed that I was in a different spot in the bed than when I had gone down to sleep. Emily and I had seemed to switch places. I was very sore and I felt just completely drained. A couple of days later, Ash called me and asked if I remember anything from after I fell asleep. I said no and asked why. She told me that her boyfriend had woke up around 5 in the morning and that he saw me standing in front of the cubbyhole that housed her Ouija board, that I just stood there in the dark, silent. After that, we had a falling out, and I just did not have the time for her or her Ouija board crap. My mom was dying and my sister was getting married. Another year had gone by and it was about a week before my mom died. And my mom kept telling me to get the boy away from her, to get the boy away. While my dad just thought it was her dying and seeing things, it made me wonder. Honestly, my mom was not a great person. And I wondered, could it have been the demon that's been haunting me?
Let me begin by giving you a little backstory to this particular situation. It was a humid summer night in June of 2008 or 2009, around 2 a.m. I'm a paramedic in a very, very rural area. We have a population of about 22,000. That covers about 500 square miles. The service I work for covered all 911 calls during this time. I'd been a paramedic for about 2 years. Prior to that, I had been an EMT for 3. The majority of the calls we received were either shortness of breath, due to 50% of the community being retired coal mine workers with some form of COPD or emphysema, and the rest being drug-seeking individuals with the occasional shooting, stabbing, or car accident. That particular night, I was dispatched to a call of a female patient who was hearing voices and seeing things that weren't there, according to her spouse. Around this time is when bath salts and all that synthetic medication stuff exploded, and people were overdosing quite frequently. In my mind, I knew this was what was going on before I even left my station. Looking back now, though, I honestly wish it was just that. When I was given the address, I was kinda shocked. It wasn't in the usual slums that we pick up overdoses. It was in a part of the county that was known to have very nice homes, homes of the working class people. Upon arriving to this person's home, it reassured my thought. The place was a well-kept 2-story brick house. When I knocked on the door and announced my usual greeting, "EMS, did someone call for an ambulance?" I was met by a 40-ish-year-old man. I did not need to ask where the patient was. Across from the room sat a female around the same age, just staring at us with an empty glare. It sent chills down my spine, and the look on my partner's face, it told me he must have felt the same. The type of stare I've never witnessed again, just empty. I introduced myself and my partner and asked her name. Her eyes moved from my partner and looked me dead in the face, and with a voice that should not have come from a 130-pound female, she said, "You are too late, Joshua. They are already here." The voice gave me goosebumps. I shook it off and I asked her who was here. She was still staring me directly in the eyes and had not blinked once, and she said, "Don't you feel us around you?" At that time, I had already decided I wanted to get the heck out of this house. All I felt was heaviness in that house. It filled me with unease. She had no medical history, or took any medications according to her husband, and she was a very healthy-looking individual. Things just didn't add up. I refrained from asking any questions and just walked her outside as quickly as possible towards my ambulance. During this time, she's muttering to herself and whipping her head from side to side as if someone were speaking into her ears. I'm not a religious person at all, but this made me wonder if I was the right person to be taking care of this patient, and not a priest. I loaded her into the ambulance and began my normal assessment. She hadn't looked at me, but she was just shifting her eyes left and right, never looking at anything for more than 2 seconds. I took her vital signs, I applied a cardiac monitor, and I told her I intended on starting an IV on her. She suddenly stared at me once again and smiled with a malicious grin. Then she said, "Do what you please, boy." I've never felt in my life so weirded out by such a small woman. It was like looking into the eyes of evil itself. After starting the IV, I sat behind her and I began the 10-minute transport to the hospital. All the while, I couldn't wait to get this thing out of my ambulance. All of a sudden, 5 minutes into the transport, she began chuckling in a low, deep voice that turned my blood cold. I moved back over in front of her and asked if everything was okay. I was met with that same malicious grin and silence. She wouldn't speak, and didn't for the remainder of the trip. About 2 minutes out, I called the local ER and informed them I was coming with a very unique patient. I personally knew all the nurses and physicians from working years alongside them. They laughed me off until they saw her with their own 2 eyes. She wouldn't speak, just grin and stare. They placed her on the same equipment I had put her on and returned to the nurse's station. I began to explain what had happened. They all got a good laugh at my expense as they could tell I was visually shaken. So I just told them, if you don't believe in evil, she will change your mind. At that time, the monitor they placed on her that can be seen at the nursing station alarmed. Her respirations were 40 times a minute. Her nurse, who was a very good friend of mine, walked into the doorway of her room and just gasped and placed her hand over her mouth. She was petrified. Of course, curiosity got the best of me, and I went over to examine her myself. How I wish I would have just stopped there, just dropped her off then and ran back to the station. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She was only touching the bed with the tips of her toes and the back of her head. The entire body was in an arch, arms laid flat beside her, and her eyes locked on the 2 of us. She was panting in a way that sounded like a growl. We called the doctor into the room, and we just said, "Oh my God." He ordered her a very powerful sedative called Versed, which is what they give you right before you have a surgery. 2 milligrams is plenty enough to put a decent-sized man to sleep for a while. She remained in this position for at least 5 minutes, but it seemed a lot longer. Her eyes were dark and empty. Her voice was otherworldly. My blood again turned to ice. She didn't fight at all when they administered the medication. 20 seconds later, she was asleep. Or so we thought. The doctor ordered a full head CT and blood work. I was pulled into her room by the nurses just in case she became violent or worse. I reached out for her arm to place a tourniquet to help draw lab work. As soon as I touched her skin, though, her eyes peeled back open. She stared at me with that same empty look as the nurse went to get another dose of Versed. 2 more milligrams, and she was still staring into my soul. I broke eye contact in hopes she would just go to sleep, but it never happened. The amount of medication could tranquilize anyone. We drew labs without an incident, all while hoping she would test positive for something. Her lab work came back as well as her CT. Everything was negative. Nothing was out of the ordinary in the slightest way. She hadn't even taken a Tylenol. While we were discussing with the doctor what they would do next, the silence of this small-town ER was broken by a blood-curdling scream, followed by words in a deep, raspy voice that I will never forget. "I am Legion." Then silence. By then I had had enough. I returned to the station. I called the ER back about an hour later to see if anything else had happened. She was transferred to a psychiatric unit about 2 hours away. I never cared to check up on her, and have no desire to this day. I pass that same home from time to time, and it sends shivers down my spine. This has become somewhat of a legend around the hospital. No one truly believes everything that happened. For the 7 people who did witness what happened, there is no doubt something otherworldly was there. Just writing and recalling that night filled me with chills. It is one night I will never forget. That was the only time I looked at pure evil, and I hope it is the last. I'm 29 years old now and still work as a paramedic. And every time I get a call of someone hearing voices, I can't help but think about her.
When I was younger, around 18 or 20, I lived for a while at my paternal grandmother's house. During this time, I was with a girl who became pregnant with my son. This story is about something that happened to us when she was over one day. It may have ended in tragedy for everyone if I was just seconds late. My grandma's old place, she now lives in a very nice condo a few blocks over, never gave me the creeps. I had never heard stories about anything unnatural happening there. And even with my other experiences, I had never encountered a negative presence in the house. And I had been over a lot when I was growing up, when my parents were working or away on business. I should mention that my parents had been separated since I was young. When I stayed at my grandma's in adulthood, I got my old room in the basement, dark and unfinished, but still comfortable. On this day, my pregnant girlfriend, not my ex, was over relaxing, talking about baby stuff, usual dating things. She got thirsty, so she asked me to get her a glass of water from the main floor kitchen. So I jumped up and headed upstairs, getting slightly sidetracked by my uncle who had come by, but only for a few seconds. After a brief conversation with him, I grabbed her a glass of water from the tap and I came back downstairs, pushing open the sheets to my room, our makeshift door. What I found was my girlfriend on her back. Her eyes were bulging and bloodshot, and her face was beginning to turn blue. It looked like she was being pinned down. She wasn't able to move. I swiftly ran over, unsure about what was happening. I tried talking to her, but got no response. I tried handing her the cup, but she still did not move. I grabbed her shoulder, seemingly knocking her out of it, and she suddenly gasped for air, like she had been running for miles. She was shaking and muttering and crying. I helped her up into a sitting position, slowly giving her sips of the water I had gotten. She explained to me that as I went upstairs, she was suddenly grabbed, forced into the bed, and felt 2 strong hands gripping around her throat. They were squeezing tighter and tighter by the second, while something kept her from being able to fight back. The room felt suddenly darker, like something was angry and watching. Something was indignant that it didn't finish the job. that I had interfered, however accidental that help was. My sanctuary, my home, it now felt like I was very much unwelcome, and as if this thing hated me being there. I got mad. I was upset, not only at this thing for making my safe place unwelcome, but obviously at it for risking my girlfriend's life, and the life of my unborn child. I come from an Irish Catholic family, so I began to pray. I began to use whatever will I could muster to tell this thing to bluntly go away. It didn't completely work. Sure, it felt like it moved further away, maybe backed off, but it was just like it was pacing outside, whatever border my will and prayers created. It felt like it knew I couldn't hold it back forever with just my will. My room was now its hunting ground as far as it was concerned, and instead of 2, it now had 3 targets that it wasn't willing to let go of whatever tiny barriers I could come up with. But I did have an idea. I quickly rushed her as safely as I could over to the other side of the basement. I wanted her to be closer to what I thought would help. It was the small shrine of crosses and crucifixes dedicated to my late grandfather. This thing seemed to realize what I was doing, and it felt madder and darker, and I started pressing closer as we moved into the room with this beautiful shrine dedicated to the great man. It was fast, but thankfully we were faster. We got to the now brightly lit area of candles and religious symbols. It stopped dead outside whatever barrier this caused. I believe we had beaten it. I got her situated and began to ask God and my grandfather to protect us, to get this thing to leave. It was not welcome in this house. I prayed and begged hard, for the sake of myself, my girlfriend, my son, and my family that lived in the house. Finally, with some kind of feeling that resembled an angry growl, the feeling of darkness in the house disappeared. From that day on, though, I kept a cross in my room and around my neck. I'm a male, and I used to work as a juvenile probation officer for a southern state in the United States. As you can imagine, working in juvenile justice can be very unsettling. Some of these kids needed some help, and some needed intensive help. Then there were those that were monsters in the making. One kid I met in that category was a kid I'll call Tony. Tony was put on probation for a year on a drug charge for simple possession and fighting in school. He seemed like a nice kid though, quiet, very polite, always kept curfew and did great in school. He kept all of his probation appointments, and most of his teachers really liked him. Other than the drug charge and the fighting incident, he had no record. He was pretty much a model probationee. About 3 months prior to him finishing probation, he came in for a drug test, and unfortunately he failed the drug test. Even though I liked Tony, I told him that the drug test meant I had to file a violation of probation, or VOP, charge against him. He begged me not to file the charge, but I told him he failed the test, so I had to file the charge. And that's when things hit the fan, so to speak. He began mumbling something under his breath. I said, "Tony, if you have something to say, speak up," or something to that effect. So he says to me, "ABC 987. And I said, "What?" "ABC 987, was his reply. I said, "I don't know what that means. What are you talking about?" "ABC 987, now in a lower, more menacing tone, with a very creepy grin coming across his face. Then it hit me. Tony was repeating my license plate number. Every time I'd gone to Tony's house or to his school, I was always in a state vehicle. And to my knowledge, he'd never seen me getting in or out of my car. And there were several cars parked in the parking area, all belonging to the building I worked in, because it shared a parking area with about 3 other medium-sized office buildings. The look on my face must have told him that I knew what ABC 987 meant, because his eyes lit up, and his smile became even more sinister. As an aside, I've had to deal with some insane kids that made plans to kill other people, a kid that liked to drink animal blood, kids that raped people. I even performed an initial assessment on a kid that was planning on doing a school massacre and filming it for the internet. But nothing has creeped me out as much as that smile did at that moment. I will be the first to admit that all professionalism went out the door at that moment. and I began to yell obscenities at him. My boss came into the scene, and he had Tony escorted out. Then he talked to me. After I told him about telling me my license plate number, she decided to file an additional charge of making threats to a public official against Tony because it was clear to her what he was doing. I testified at the hearing about a month later, and yes, he was not locked up during that time, so I was fearful that something might happen. The judge sentenced him to an inpatient psychiatric hospital for an evaluation. That would be followed by another hearing and further recommendations based on the evaluation. Right before he got out of the psychiatric hospital, I transferred to another department with the state. However, I heard that right before he left the hospital, they found a list in his room with the judge's name, my name, and his public defender's name, the prosecutor's name, and some teachers' and students' name, all with the words, "Altar Sacrifice," written on the page. Needless to say, at the hearing, which I was permitted to attend, normally juvenile hearings are closed to the public. The psychiatrist that prepared Tony's evaluation recommended that he be sentenced to the state hospital for an extended period of time, which the judge agreed with. I hope Tony was able to get the help that he needed, and I hope that he turned out all right. But one thing it taught me is that sometimes, even a monster can hide in plain sight and under the guise of innocence, and that the most horrible and creepiest monsters out there are human beings. Though I'm not sure if Tony was a human, a demon, or something of a host for a spirit, far more sinister than I bargained for. Who knows if that was really him, or something that has attached itself to him. This happened around 3 years ago. I went to sleep over at my cousin's house for a weekend, and my Aunt Jenny was all into this paranormal crap, like Ouija boards and all that kind of stuff. My cousins and I believed that if she played with the Ouija board, then demons and spirits would enter her house. Olivia, Harper, and me all shared a room that night. We stole my aunt's iPad and watched horror movies because we liked to get scared. Eventually, it was too much for us, so we decided to turn it off. My two cousins fell asleep soon after that, but I couldn't. It took me a while just to feel tired. Eventually, I was about to nod off, and I started to hear voices. But everyone in the house was sleeping. No one was awake. Olivia and Harper had a 2-year-old little brother and parents, that was all. So I woke up my two cousins, and I told them, I hear voices, and I don't recognize them. Olivia looked at me. We got up and walked out of the room to Jack's room, her little brother. As soon as we walked in, the lights turned on. And then shortly after, they began to flicker on and off, as if someone was playing with the light switch. Then those weird voices came again. And let me say, now that I could hear it a little bit better, they sounded like they were speaking in a different language. And for some reason, they just wouldn't leave. Right before we picked up Jack out of his crib, a shadowy figure, around 7 feet tall, appeared over it. We all jumped back. It seemed to be blurry. We couldn't make out its details very well. But it looked to be crying blood, or something red. We were all frozen in place. This thing seemed to be looking down at Jack, but then it slowly turned toward us. Then, in a very slow, steady motion that seemed to take ages, it raised up what appeared to be hands with scraggly fingernails at the tips, and it waved at us. And at that moment, I felt fear and anxiety stronger than I've ever felt before, than I think I'll ever feel again. Its hands didn't even look like hands. They were so monstrous. I picked up Jack quickly, and we ran out of the room and back into Olivia's. We stayed there all night, watching the door, unable to sleep. The next morning, we told my cousin's parents. I remember their horrified faces. Now, in the typical stories, you'd expect the people to say that it was just a nightmare, that we're just kids with creative imaginations or something like that. Not this time, because they told us that they thought their daughter had walked into their room and crawled into bed with them, but eventually she got out of bed, and the figure was no longer their daughter, but a tall black shape. This demonic figure walked out of their room. Later that year, they moved out, and I like to believe it's probably because there were demons in that house. To this day, what scares me the most is that my aunt was the one that brought that figure into their home. She practically summoned this demon, as it began to haunt her family not long after playing with that stupid Ouija board. And now the image of that thing waving at us. It follows me in my dreams, and every time I close my eyes, that demon is there waving at me. A little background is necessary so you can understand how it relates to what has happened. I am a Wiccan, and I'm no stranger to the occult or spirits. Strange things that scare most people happen around me all the time, so most weird things don't really frighten me. I don't like to tell too many people that I'm Wiccan. I would rather do what I do and be left alone. That being said, I do help people when they have problems of the spiritual kind. In October of 2016, I was on Facebook, and I saw some sort of advertisement for a movie about children and Ouija boards. It was getting to be Halloween time. I did a post about it and tagged one of my friends who was also a practitioner. I was being facetious when I did it because movies like this annoy me and my friend both. There's always some skeptic out there that thinks it's a child's toy. They end up getting one just to prove that it's only a game. Then they come to find out the hard way that it can be something much darker. And then in the end, they end up no longer being skeptics. Ouija boards easily open doorways that at times are harder to close. They open gateways on the other side, and anything can come through. If you don't know how to safeguard yourself, if you don't know how to close these doors, you can find yourself in serious trouble. Susie, a woman whom I am friends with and used to work with, made a comment on my post saying that I shouldn't post things I don't understand. She didn't know I was Wiccan, and she did not know I was actually criticizing the Ouija board post. I private messaged her and told her I actually knew a great deal. She then went on to mention that she used one when she was a teenager, and stated that because of that, she's had experiences that have affected her to this very day. I asked what she meant by that. She was extremely reluctant to tell me because she was scared that I would think her crazy. She even told me that she told a priest of her faith about her experiences, and he said that her troubles were that of the mind and not the spirit. Basically, the arrogant guy was politely telling her she was insane. After some reassurance with me, she went on to tell me about her living hell. She told me that she used to have friends when she was younger that meddled with the Ouija board all the time. But what she did not realize at the time was that they were purposely summoning dark spirits. Susie's mom never let her leave the house after a certain time, but one night she let her go out, and she went to her friend's house to hang out because her friends were having a party. They pulled out the board and started doing and saying some very strange things. The moment she saw that board, she was filled with dread and felt a chill in the air. One of her friends came in holding a coffer, which she assumed to be red wine, and he offered it to the group. She saw everyone drinking from it, and since she was a huge germaphobe, she refused. What happened next felt like a huge nightmare. It has severely impacted her to this day. She found out later that the coffer was filled with the sacrificial blood of a cat. She later discovered this because she found the body of a gutted cat outside. She was horrified. Later on, she confronted her friends about the cat and the drinking of its blood. She wanted to understand what they were trying to do and why they didn't tell her what was going on. They probably didn't tell her because, knowing Susie, she would have noped out of there really fast. When she demanded to know what they were doing, she didn't really get a straight answer. Her relationship with her best friend that hung around with this group of people became strained from this experience and soon got toxic. She stopped talking to her shortly after. She would see the members of this group in the hallways at school, but Susie never talked to them again. The backlash from that incident didn't end there. She told me nothing was ever the same after that night. Soon after, strange things began to happen to her and around her. Something stuck with her, something attached itself to her that night, and it has stayed with her ever since. She told me it didn't matter where she was or where she went. Whatever it was followed her. She told me that she has learned to live with it and ignored it, but others around her were starting to have experiences and it was scaring them. She told me of an instance where she fell asleep with the webcam on. She was talking to her cousin late at night one evening. She suddenly woke up because her bed was shaking. She sat up, and her cousin told her she heard a man's voice coming from the laptop. and the picture on her end went out. She told me that that wasn't possible. She was the only one in the house at the time. There would be nights where she would open her eyes from sleeping and see something watching her. When she did this, she couldn't move. It was a scary-looking man who would soon disappear before her eyes. She told me that one of her friends absolutely refused to come over anymore because weird things always happened when she did. Susie told me of another night where she went to her mom's house. Susie, her mom, and her nephew were all heading out when suddenly they heard a man with a very deep voice call her name. Susie. She looked around to see who it was. She looked at the window and there it was standing. It was there only a moment, and then it disappeared. Her mother didn't see it, but she definitely heard it. Her mother knew something strange was in that house, and it terrified everyone. Susie said other than her, only her nephew has ever seen it. Everyone else has only heard of it and felt its presence. Now, these kinds of experiences have been going on since she was in her mid-teens. At the time of her telling me the story, she is now in her late 20s. I decided that I was going to help her rid herself of this spirit. I told her that I was Wiccan, that I have experience with these kinds of matters. I was going to help her get rid of this possession or attached entity. I had this conversation with her the evening of October 30th of 2016. After I said goodnight to Susie, I tucked in my daughter and got ready for bed. My husband at the moment was already sleeping. I was in bed by 8:30. At exactly midnight, now officially Halloween, I heard the radio clock go off in the second bedroom on the other side of my house. It was loud, and I was surprised that it didn't wake my husband or my daughter. That bedroom is a guest room, and no one sleeps there on a regular basis, so I had no idea what that sound was. I didn't have any guests that night, so there was no reason why it should have been going off. I got up quickly and went to the other bedroom and turned on the light. There was the alarm clock blaring loud music at exactly 12 a.m. I had turned it off, and right at that moment, the hairs in the back of my neck stood up, and I was covered in goosebumps. I felt a dark presence in my house. I knew exactly what it was. It must have been Susie's friend trying to scare me. Well, I wasn't scared. I was angry, and I told whatever it was to get out. Soon after, my goosebumps went away, and the tingling on the back of my neck subsided. I'm surprised that didn't wake my husband or my daughter with my outburst. I went back to bed angry and irritated. The next day, I heard from Susie again. She was telling me that the spirit had been tormenting her, and that it was worse than it has ever been. She told me that it was shaking her bed, clawing at her, and at one point had thrown her up against the wall and knocked her to the floor. I told her that I knew it would get angry with her, because she is talking to me and we are trying to get rid of it. And I told her about it visiting me the previous night. She apologized, but I told her not to worry. It did not scare me. I immediately went out and got her a kit to do a smudging of her home and herself. I also made some anointing oil. I explained to Susie that she needed to do the cleansing to empower herself. Susie later came over to my house to obtain the things needed to do the cleansing that I had acquired for her. When I saw her, she told me that the entity was trying to keep her from visiting me at all. Apparently, her car wouldn't start that day. She also had problems with her computer, and she hasn't been receiving messages on her phone. I asked if she wanted me to come over to her house to help her with the cleansing. Susie is a very determined woman, and despite her haunting, she's a very strong one too. She assured me that I had given her enough detailed instruction and that she did not need me there. So Susie went home and I didn't hear from her. I texted her the next day to see how things were, and she informed me that she didn't sleep that night. When she attempted to smudge her home, the feather burst into flames and she was unable to do the cleansing. If the evil entity burned her smudging feather, then that was my fault. I didn't even think to bless the smudging kit itself. The spirit tormented Susie all night. She told me she was at work at the moment and was too scared to go home. She was now going on 48 hours without sleeping. I told her to come to my house, that she would be safe in my home and that she could sleep here. She declined, but wanted to know what to do. I told her to get another feather, and to get holy water and sprinkle that on her kit, and ask God to bless it. She did that, but she knew she would be too tired to perform the cleansing that night, and she was still scared to go home. She asked again what she should do. I instructed her to command the spirit in the name of God to leave her alone and give her peace. So the next day I texted her and asked if she was okay. She replied back that she was at work, and she did exactly what I told her to do. She slept peacefully the night before, for the first time in a while. I was relieved. A few days later, Susie called me, telling me that she got a call from her mother. Her mother told her that she heard loud noises and banging coming from Susie's old room. When her mom went to investigate, Susie's old stuff was all over the place. It looked like a tornado had ripped through the room. Apparently, the spirit had taken refuge at her mother's house after the cleansing, and had made sure to make its presence known. Luckily, though, it did not bother her mother. It simply attacked that room. Susie was upset, and again she asked me what to do, so I walked her through how to cleanse that part of the house. After that, weeks went by without incident. Then Susie and I met up for some Thai for an early dinner a couple of weeks later. When she came to pick me up, we began to talk, and she told me that there was another incident with the entity. But it wasn't at her mom's house or her home. She was visiting a friend's house when her friend's brother came running out of his room screaming. He was yelling, it's moving by itself." Susie and her friend ran into her friend's brother's room, and lo and behold, and of course he had been using a Ouija board. Susie and her friend watched in horror and disbelief as it spelled out, "I will never leave you alone," over and over again. Susie ran over to the board and said, "Leave me alone and go away." She flipped the board over, and when the activity stopped, she threw it away in the garbage. Even though her friend's brother was angry at her for doing that, she yelled at him to never use a Ouija board again. She didn't have any problems after that. And after hearing that story, I couldn't help but think, oh, for God's sake. Now, I know there are those out there listening to this story, not believing a word of it, or thinking me and my friend are crazy. And that's okay. I hope those of you listening that think that never have an incident to change your perception. Ouija boards are never to be used by children or most adults for that matter. They're not toys, and serious harm can come to those who simply play with them.
Years ago, my mother and I used to go to the southern part of Texas known as the Valley. My mom's side of the family lived there and also in Corpus Christi. It was a great getaway since our whole house was always full. With 4 sisters and my mother and only 2 rooms, it was a fiasco. One weekend, my mom said for us to pack a few articles of clothing because we were going to go to Harlingen, where my grandmother lived, and we'd be staying with my aunt in a nearby town about 20 minutes away from my grandma's. I always had a good time there, because the cousin that lived with my aunt was my age, and we got along very well, so I knew it was going to be fun. We arrived in Harlingen and visited my grandmother all day. Then finally my mom said, "Let's go. Your aunt and I are going to go out later, so I need to start getting ready." We drove to my aunt's house. Now, her house was once a housing unit for soldiers way back when, and the home was huge. I stayed with my cousin in his room, and we played video games well into the night. My mom and aunt finally left at around 10 p.m., and they said they'd be gone for a while. So, of course, my cousin and I kept playing video games. Later on that night, my cousin asked me, "When you got here, did you get a weird feeling? Did you feel anything?" I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't feel a thing at all. Puzzled, I asked why. He told me, "Well, I've seen things here, and I saw the devil himself." The moment he said that, I had a creepy feeling in my stomach, because he had the look of fear in his eyes I've never seen. I couldn't disbelieve him. I tried really hard to let that feeling go, and it got more intense later in the night. Eventually, I fell asleep on the floor by my cousin's bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I looked up toward him, only to see him sitting up in bed, staring into the doorway. The hallway was dimly lit from the porch light, and we were at the other end of the house. I asked my cousin what was wrong, and he said, "Hush, I hear something. I think it's happening again." After he said that, I turned to look towards the hallway myself, and what I saw changed my life forever. It is forever embedded into my memory. We heard footsteps with the noise of spurs on boots, and then a tall black shadow that looked like a man in a trench coat with a black cowboy hat came into the doorway and began walking towards the back door. I gasped quietly, and as soon as I did, the figure stopped. He stood motionless for a moment, and then he slowly turned, looking to where my cousin and I were. The smell of sulfur filled the room, and after what seemed like an eternity, the figure turned again and walked towards the back door. We did not hear the door slam, so we waited an hour or so until we got the courage to get up and look. We turned on all the lights in the room and walked to the door. The hallway was freezing cold, and we saw nothing. The smell of sulfur was still there though, and the door had a charcoal handprint on it. We even tried to wipe the handprint off, but it stayed there no matter what we did. When my mom and aunt came back, we told them everything that had happened, and they were scared. My aunt prayed over the house. She sprayed holy water through the whole thing. After that, my aunt moved out, and my cousin and I still talk about it every once in a while. Since then, though, I have never felt fear as palpable and powerful as I did that night. So, it's been a long time since this happened, so please excuse me if I forget to mention something that did happen. I've dealt with multiple paranormal things in my life, from a ghost of a little girl to some sort of hate-feeding demon. But this story I'm about to tell you was sort of close to me. I used to have a haunted Krusty doll. A little backstory. Since I was little, I have always loved watching The Simpsons. My favorite character being Bart for his antics and twisted sense of humor when it comes to watching cartoons. So when I had found a Bart doll, along with Krusty the Clown and Marge inside an antique mall that was just outside my town, my mom said I could pick out two, knowing that I loved the show so much. I had picked Bart and Krusty, cause for whatever reason, Marge was missing her dress. I've had these dolls for years, and never noticed anything strange about them, until I was 14 or 15 years old, when my life started getting really hard. Having to move a lot, my parents fought, and my mom and sister treated me like shit, and I developed a really bad problem. I was so incredibly lonely and hurt, I would go to my plushies for comfort. Snuggling them, or just having them near me while I played video games, would make me feel better. So as my 15th or 16th birthday started getting closer, my mom asked me what I wanted. So, I told her I wanted a plushie of Dr. Eggman from the Sonic the Hedgehog series, cause he was my favorite. After a month or so, I had got him in the mail. Then, of course, I had added him to the collection on my bed. But things started getting weird after this. I would find my new plush in other places like on the floor, or under my bed, or even sometimes across the room. One night, I just held on to my new plush, cause I was tired of having to find it every morning. But when I woke up, I was holding on to my Krusty, and my new plush was at the closet door on the other side of the room. At this point, I was a lot more aware of the paranormal activity with his doll. I started leaving the doll on the other bed that was in my room, but when I'd come back, it would either be fallen over, or on the floor in between the beds, or back on the bed I slept on, where it used to sit. Currently, I don't have it in my possession. Due to moving so much, I had left it in storage. The storage place sucks, so I won't be surprised if it's eaten by rats now. I've always loved to explore abandoned houses and buildings. Every trip I would find the usual stuff: broken furniture, shattered glass, and lots of junk. On a few occasions, though, I would see a homeless man or a group of teens smoking or drinking. On this particular day, me and my girlfriend, who we'll call Vicky, set off to explore this abandoned building we had seen close to our house. The building appeared to be an old hospital or nursing home, based on the number of wheelchairs and medical gear thrown around the place. When we first entered, the only thing that seemed off was that there was a very odd smell. Not bad, just odd. Almost like burning hair and rotten meat. We ignored it, thinking it was a dead animal or old rotten wood. As we continued, we seemed to be going deeper into the building, getting closer to this odd smell. After about a half hour of walking through, we came to room 135. The door was demolished. There were chunks blown off of it, large gashes and weird stains all over it. But somehow it still managed to sit on its old rusted door hinges. I pushed it open with my foot, and honestly I expected a crap-filled empty room like the rest. But no. Instead, we found a room filled with random animal carcasses. Birds, rabbits, things like that. Each with varying amounts of decay, some bone, some fresh. It was the fact that some were fresh that really disturbed me. Wanting to impress my girlfriend, despite the creepiness and grossness of it all, I raised my shoulders and I walked ahead of her. Everything seemed to be fine, I guess. I turned to my left at one point, and when I did, I saw something extremely terrifying. There was a large black and red figure crouching down, and it was clawing at a piece of wood. It seemed to be blurred for some reason, as if the image of this thing was glitching somehow. It had a large black torso with strange shades of red all over. The legs and feet seemed to be too long for the body. I couldn't make out much, but I could tell that its neck was extremely thin, and it seemed its head ended in a snout, and from that snout something dark dripped. I must have stared at this thing for a full minute, before finally something even worse happened. It spoke to me. "Last night, boy." It sounded like 20 different voices speaking at once, but with a deep and guttural undertone. Immediately, I ran towards the door, grabbing my girlfriend by the hand. We ran together, but I don't think the thing followed us. When we got back to the car, we drove for about 5 minutes before I stopped. I got out, walked to the side of the road, and puked up my guts. My girlfriend asked me what I saw. Apparently, she didn't see it. She didn't enter the room after all, and that means she did not see the demon thing, but she did hear the voice. I lied, and I said that it was just some homeless guy. Because what would I tell this girl? That I saw a demon? No, I wouldn't say that. I would sound crazy. But to this day, it haunts me. That voice, it still comes to me in my mind. And I still wonder, why was it so calm? And why did it not chase us? To this day, my girlfriend thinks that I threw up from all of the dead animals in the room.